Morning everyone. Sorry about the slight delay in joining this morning. After all this time of working with online events, we still managed to have a slight hiccup getting going, but we're here now. Katy's having a few technical issues, so hopefully she'll join us shortly. So I'm Nikki Hudson. I'm the principal investigator on the EDNA project. I'm going to be giving a bit of an introduction to the event and then to the project, telling you a little bit more about what we've been doing, and then we have a programme of speakers from the team. So yeah, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's nice to see so many of you here and from all over the place as well. It's great that we've got attendees coming, and I'm sure for some of you it's maybe very early in the morning. And also that we've got a variety of people attending as well from kind of different backgrounds and different interests in relationship to egg donation. So the EDNA project has been a bit of a journey. We've been working on this project for almost 5 years now, with some disruptions obviously with the last couple of years, but also Brexit, which I wouldn't recommend doing a European comparative study in the context of something like Brexit, but we're still here to tell the tale. And so yeah, it's thanks to the team, really, the great team that we've got, which is on the next slide. We've just a little overview of the team. So we've got a large team working across 3 countries. We've had researchers in each of our 3 sites working on the team at various points in time. Not everybody's been able to make it today, so we're sorry to miss some of the team, but you'll hear from some of the other members of the team this morning, and we've got some members that are going to join in for the Q&A as well, which is fantastic. So yeah, thanks to the team who have been a great support throughout this project. Thanks also to our project partner, the Seed Trust, and our funders, the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK. It's been a bit of a journey and an exciting one, and hopefully today we'll bring you kind of where we're up to, I guess, with these large-scale projects. Obviously there's a lot of work going on still, work in progress as they say, so we've got a lot to come, but we'll be able to bring you some of the key findings today. So in terms of that programme, next slide, we've got, I'm going to give an introduction and an overview to the EDNA study. I'll talk a little bit about our rationale for the project and some of our kind of key findings. And then we'll hear from Katy Caveni, who's going to talk about our website analysis that we did as part of the study. And then Vincenzo Pavoni is going to talk to you a little bit about our work on the business models of egg donation in the European context. And then finally, Christina is going to provide some of the an overview of some of the data from the interviews with the women that were providing their eggs as part of this. And then we'll have some time for Q&A, and hopefully by that time Katy's technical issues will be resolved and she'll be back to be able to chair the Q&A, and hopefully you will all have some questions. So how this will work is that if you add your questions to the Q&A icon, we'll collect those, but they'll be published at the point in time we do the Q&A. So we'll hold those back until the question and answer session, so that we can go through those later on, as opposed to kind of having them coming in as we speak. But you can certainly submit them, and we'll be able to look at those, and we can deal with those at the end collectively. So yeah, I think that's it in terms of the overview and the welcome, and I will now move on to talk a little bit about the rationale for the project, and just a quick, sorry, missed a slide, a quick mention of where you can find more information as well about the project. So we have project pages. We've also got a blog where we've been putting out information kind of prior to and in between publications, but also that's where we're linking our publications as well. So if you want to follow the blog, you can do for updates. The project's got a Twitter account as well, where you can follow for updates as things come out from the project, as well as from the Centre for Reproduction Research, where we're based, where the project was hosted. So please do sign up for updates throughout. I hope that was the last of the slides from the intro session. So yes, okay, so on to the overview. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we decided to do this project, how we did the project. It was quite a large scale, complicated project. and give you a bit of a flavour of some of the key findings from the study before our other speakers go on to kind of give you some more of the kind of granularity around some of the kind of key aspects of the project, some of the key phases. You might ask why egg donation. You know, egg donation has now been around almost as long as IVF itself. The first egg donation baby was born in 1984, 6 years after Louise Brown, and so in a sense has become a kind of routine treatment for fertility issues. And so we were interested to look at it for precisely those reasons, that, you know, we hear a lot more about newer technologies, newer treatments, newer options, and we were interested in what has happened to egg donation in the meantime, in terms of what has happened over the last almost 40 years as other forms of ART have developed, different treatment add-ons have developed, different we're going to talk a little bit today about the process of vitrification and the impact of vitrification on egg donation. So we hear a lot currently about the uses of vitrification, for example, for people who want to freeze their own eggs, but we were interested in how vitrification has shaped the landscape of egg donation. So we were interested to look at how that broader ART landscape, but also how social changes may have impacted on the use of egg donation as well. You know, if we are getting to a point where we might consider egg donation to be more routinized, how does that look in comparison to when it was first used and it was a handful of cycles? And at the time when egg donation was first introduced, pioneered, the model tended to be that it was one woman who was providing eggs to another woman, usually herself going through fertility treatment, providing eggs to another woman, usually in a heterosexual relationship, and the numbers were very small. And so the difference, if you look at egg donation, how it was when it first began to how it's evolved and how we see it now, it's very different. And so we were interested to drill down into that changing landscape. And one of the key differences is in the numbers of cycles. So if we look at the recent figures for egg donation in the UK, which are on the next slide, we see that since 1998, which is the first year when ESRA produced disaggregated data on egg donation, we see that the numbers have gone from this shows the egg donation cycles in Europe as a proportion of all ART cycles. So they've moved from just under 2% of all ART cycles to almost 7.5% in 2017, which is the last year that we have data for. So quite a considerable increase over that period of time. We see, if you look at the numbers year on year, the increase. There is an increase year on year in the number of egg donation cycles as a proportion of the whole of ART. So we were interested in that increase, and also in the fact that egg donation is increasingly used in a range of scenarios. So we've moved away from what we might consider that kind of conventional use of egg donation into a much broader number of applications in terms of its use by gay male couples using surrogacy, for example, or increasingly in cases of age-related fertility decline. And so we've seen both a diversification and also an increase. So we were really interested to look more at that picture. There are also a range of other changes, as I've mentioned. So things like patient and egg donor mobilities, people moving around for this kind of treatment, but also things like the advent of direct consumer genetic testing, people being able to find their donors and recipients and offspring through the use of those sort of related technologies. So it's a very different picture than it was in 1984. Next slide, please. So part of our rationale was to look at a kind of looking back and a looking forward at where we are with egg donation, but also interestingly, there hasn't been a great deal of research about egg donors or egg providers. We switch between those two terms, and we can talk about that a little bit in the discussion. We've tended to use egg providers when we've published and when we're writing about this, but people have tended to use donor and donation when we talk to them in our empirical work, and we can talk a little bit about the slippage around language in this area and what that might mean. But there tends to be limited evidence in the European context. Much of the work in Europe has come, or the majority, from the UK, although that picture is changing. We now have other work going on in Spain and France and so on, and some of the Scandinavian countries. But looking at as a whole, actually, there's a relative shortage of understanding, or a relatively limited understanding of egg donors' experiences in the European context. So we wanted to kind of explore that, the reasons for that, and also to kind of address that gap. We were interested in Europe, we're all based in Europe, but we're interested in Europe because it also makes a really interesting case in the context of EU-wide regulation. So I mentioned Brexit earlier, and that was a very difficult kind of phenomenon in the case of trying to do this research, but also interesting in terms of the shifts around regulation in the EU context. But actually, when we started the project, when we designed the project, and until relatively recently, the UK were obviously part of the EU, but the EU provides a kind of overarching regulatory framework for tissue donation that each country within the EU, the 27, was 28, the 27 countries within the EU, adopts into its own regulation around tissue donation, and it does that in very differing ways. And the three cases that we chose to focus on were interesting for a number of reasons in that regard. And so we were interested in how that kind of wider framework, regulatory framework around what you can and can't do with donated human tissue might shape what happens at the individual level, and how that individual country level variation impacts on practice and people's experiences and so on. And within that context, there is no consensus about how egg donation should be managed. And so we wanted to look at some cases to look at what that might mean. So the main piece of regulation, the EU Tissues and Cells Directive, which I have a slide next, gives us this framework. And what's particularly interesting about this framework is that it obliges countries to avoid outright commercialisation. So people can't buy and sell human eggs or other forms of tissue. All countries and all of those participating in donation must uphold this philosophy of voluntary and unpaid donation. And that central tenet of the regulation has been interesting for us in how we think about how donation becomes framed in a kind of moral and economic sense, and how people make sense of that and engage with it. But that's been applied and enacted in different ways in our three countries in different ways. So these are some of the reasons that we were really interested in Europe, both because it gives us a window into how different contexts give rise to different forms of egg donation, but also specifically what's happening in relationship to commercialisation. So we had a question about, how some of the emerging practices around egg donation appear to be more commercially driven, and what does that look like, and what does that mean in the context of regulation which prohibits commercialisation. Next slide, please. So our goals then, these are our broader goals for the project, were to map this changing landscape of egg donation, but particularly thinking about how governance can keep pace with that changing practice, and within that, as I've mentioned, particularly this aspect of the kind of idea of commerciality within the context of tissue donation. And we wanted to explore egg providers' experiences within this context. So at the heart of the project, we were interested in what egg providers, how they make sense of what they're doing within differing contexts, within differing kinds of systems of egg donation, but also to think how those things are mutually shaped, how those wider economic policy and moral contexts shape women's motivations, experiences and perceptions, but also other actors. And actually some of those other actors have become as important and interesting as we've gone through the process. And also to consider the policy and practice implications for this, and we've done probably more of that work in the UK. So the funding for the project came from a UK-based funder, so some of the policy and practice implications are designed to impact that, but also have obviously had implications for European policy, but also for the other cases and the other countries in which we're working. So to move on to talk about the cases, our 3 national cases, and I'll give a little bit of an overview here, but the other talks, the other speakers will say a little bit more about that. So we chose the UK, Belgium and Spain because whilst they share kind of technological expertise and in terms of being leaders in various ways of AR techniques, and they have a long history of provision, they also have fairly liberal access to ARTs as compared to some of the other countries. So egg donation is obviously permitted in all 3 countries. They each have approached regulation quite differently, and so actually what we found was some of the things we were interested in at the beginning of the project became less interesting, and other things became more interesting as we went through, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that. So things like the number of children that can be born from the donation, how donors and recipients can be known to one another, how much compensation can be provided. Some of the key issues, I guess, that we think about when we think about regulation were what drove us to choose these 3 cases. But also things around, for example, the way in which fertility treatment is funded in the 3 countries has also proved to be very interesting in terms of how that shapes, for example, obviously access, but also how other intermediaries come into play, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've called egg intermediaries later on. So we've found actually probably much more multiplicity and difference and variation, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on than we might have even anticipated, and in different ways than we might have anticipated. Next slide, please. So in order to capture some of that complexity, we decided to approach this with an interdisciplinary framework. And one of the objectives actually of the study was to develop a kind of novel interdisciplinary lens through which we can think about egg donation in a more holistic, comprehensive approach. And we were particularly interested, as I've mentioned, in the intersection between kind of moral and economic logics and repertoires and how they may be co-constituted. So we drew on insights from sociology, bioethics and political economy broadly defined to help us create this lens, and that helped us to devise some of the novel methods that we use, which I'll talk about in a second. We were also kind of using the work of Adele Clark and colleagues and drawing on the approach of situational analysis, both in terms of helping us to explore the situations in the 3 countries in which we were working, but also to enable us to try and look across that complexity and look across the 3 different national cases. So situational analysis uses this idea that a phenomenon, here egg donation, is constituted by that situation. It can only arise in that particular form because of the constellation of relations and actors within that particular context, and different kind of elements of that context give rise to a specific form of egg donation, and I'll return to that later on. And in that sense, it can't be disentangled from that. So the idea that there is an idea of egg donation that can exist outside of that context, it becomes difficult. So that was really what was informing us as we designed the project, but has proved to be a very useful framework as we've navigated our way through. So just to look at some of the methods that we've used whilst we've been doing this research. Oh, sorry, skipped a questions slide. So our research questions here, very quickly, we were interested in looking at egg donation and how that's shaped by these different contexts or situations. We're interested in how new ways of being an egg donor has emerged out of these different contexts, different socio-technical processes. These research questions for the non-social scientists may be a little technical. So we're interested in new ways, new identities, new subjectivities related to those processes. Has egg donation changed in terms of its meaning from that process in 1984 to what it looks like now? And how do egg providers then understand and frame egg donation and what they're doing in the context of fertility treatment? We're looking at fertility treatment rather than other forms of egg donation for research and so on. And how is their moral reasoning, how they think about what they're doing, shaped by that changing landscape, those changing economics that I talked about. And we're also really interested in the role of professionals in this, their rationalities, why they do what they do, and those commercial kinds of drivers in that more now globalised reproductive marketplace than we had when IVF was first developed. And now I'll talk a little bit about the methods. So we used a range of methods to try and capture some of that complexity, and I'll talk in a second about how that was organised. And we tried to bring that interdisciplinary framework into those methods, and we used, for example, elicitation techniques within the interviews in which we gave people scenarios and asked them to talk out loud about those scenarios, and Christina is going to talk about some of that data later on in terms of people thinking about what should and shouldn't be done with egg donation with their eggs, for example. Next slide, please. So this was the organisation of the study into 4 phases. We also had a 5th dissemination phase, which isn't on here. So we had an overarching phase 1 looking at where we mapped policy, we interviewed policy and practice stakeholders. In phase 2, we looked at representations of egg donation, and for this particular piece of work we chose to look at websites, for clinic websites for that, and Katie will talk in more detail about why we did that. Phase 3, we did interviews and elicitation techniques with egg providers and also professionals. That covers actually quite a large category, and it varied in each country in terms of who was included, but it also included intermediate representatives from patient organisations and intermediaries in some cases as well. And then phase 4 was a kind of more integrative phase where we held workshops, and we've got a series of ongoing working groups actually looking at the implications. And just on the next slide, just a thank you to some of those organisations. So in the UK, we're working with our partner Seed, but also Pride Angel Fertility Network UK and Donor Conception Network, and we produced resources and some films based on some of our findings. Next slide, please. Okay, so just briefly, I'm going to talk through some of the key findings, which will give you a sort of a way into some of the presentations that we're going to hear from our other speakers. So our first finding might be obvious given what I've already said about why we were doing this and what we set out to find, but this idea that egg donation is multiple, that there is no one unified and unitary phenomena which is egg donation, and that was true across the 3 cases. So we had differences in framings, moral repertoires and understandings of egg donation across the 3 cases, but also within the 3 cases, across the 3 cases, but also within the 3 cases. And these differences in the way egg donation is enacted in those settings related to how it was regulated, particularly, and this links back to the point earlier about how different national contexts may choose to enact that European regulation, but also how the specificities of the historical development of egg donation in that context, how it fits in with other kinds of treatment, how fertility treatment is provided, was really key to that. And we've drawn on here the idea from Pranzak and Wahlberg in the next slide, of situated by a regulation, and this is the idea that how certain regulatory configurations are tied to what might be thinkable and sayable in any particular context. So this was really useful for us in terms of thinking about how egg donation comes into being in a particular setting. And here I've just listed as an example some of the different ways in which egg donation is regulated, and these were some of the aspects of regulation that we compared across the 3 national cases that give rise to very different enactments of egg donation. And if we just take the first category there, the type of provider-recipient relationship, we spent quite a lot of time at the beginning of the project thinking about this, and initially kind of assumed that there were a fairly limited number of ways in which this could happen, and when we started to map that, we found a lot more variety than we'd expected, or that we'd kind of thought about. So on the next slide, we mapped a table which shows where we tried to divide out how donors and recipients may be known to one another at the point eggs are provided versus where they are donors and recipients are known to one another, where they are and where they aren't known to one another at the point in which eggs are provided, as a way to try to manage some of the complexity. So we'd been kind of thinking about this as anonymous donation, known donation, identity release donation, but as we mapped this onto the different ways in which people were providing eggs, not necessarily always thought of as donation either. So if we think about intra-partner egg sharing, for example, same-sex female couples, where an egg is provided, but it's not egg donation, or it's not thought of as egg donation, but it is regulated within the context. So we discovered that there was actually a lot of variety and variation within how egg donation is enacted, and you can see there mapped onto that the 3 countries and the different varieties of egg donation that could be carried out in those contexts. So in this sense, we found a lot of contextual differences around the regulation of egg donation, but also different ways in which people think about what they're doing, and different framings of egg donation. Okay, next slide, please. I mentioned this earlier, and we'll pick up on the question of vitrification later on in some of the other presentations. But vitrification was one of the key changes that has transformed egg donation and enabled new practices and business models to emerge. And Vincenzo, in particular, will focus on this. Vitrification is interesting because it allows, and others have talked about this, it allows the decoupling of the provision of the eggs from the use of the eggs by a recipient. So it allows eggs to be, it's a method of fast freezing for any of you who are unfamiliar, and it allows eggs to be stored for later use, but also to be shipped and used in other contexts, so then eggs can be shipped abroad and so on. And a lot of focus has been given to the kind of globalizing nature of vitrification, that eggs can be shipped abroad. But what we found was that vitrification is transforming models of egg donation within countries. So we're working on this idea that there are these new business models that have emerged, particularly driven by vitrification, which Vincenzo will talk about later on. And this is particularly interesting in relationship to changes in regulation as well. If in the UK, where regulation around storage of eggs, for example, is increasing to 55 years, you know, that it's a good example of how regulation and technological developments can become out of sync, and what happens and what do people think about that. And Christina's going to talk a little bit about what women think about those things later on. We also found that fertility clinics and other actors are engaged, and organisations are engaged in the moral framing of egg donation, and that is heavily dominated by common narratives of altruism, solidarity and sorority. That was a unifying kind of aspect of those framings, and there were differences which Katie's going to talk about later. So those findings really drew our attention to the need not just to look at the kind of individual subjective understandings, but also the social and cultural systems and infrastructures in which donation practices are embedded, and the implications of those wider organisations for the framing of donation more generally. And actually what we found was that some of those do rest quite heavily on that original model of egg donation, but the egg donation has actually transformed, and is there a disjuncture between those things? We found that there's a range, as I mentioned earlier, a range of egg intermediaries that have emerged, and a great deal of variation and complexity. Sometimes that might be individuals, and sometimes it's organisations, and that the way those intermediaries have emerged in the 3 countries varies too. And we found that there were fewer kind of formalised intermediaries, for example, in Belgium, but that potential recipients act as intermediaries in the process of recruitment of donors, which was an interesting feature. So we have work in development to kind of capture some of that complexity, and that they're engaged in a whole range of valuation practices, the generation of value, which we can think about in relationships to this broader question of commercialisation. As I've already alluded to several times, we found that the trajectories, the ways in which women come into the process of egg donation and their experiences of providing eggs are intimately entwined with those wider social, cultural, political and economic changes, and how that emerges within localised contexts. We'll hear more from around the specifics of that from Christina, but that relates to a whole range of aspects of our data and different ways in which women talked about what they were doing within that context. And then the final kind of substantive finding here is around the growing impact of commercialisation, which we've argued elsewhere presents a number of questions, tensions and possible blind spots for national and supranational policy. You know, if we have a lot of commercial activity, how does that align with that EU directive around non-commercialisation, and how might we want to unpack that a little bit more? So we can maybe come back to that in the questions. And then finally, one of the things we hope to write about when we've recovered is the complexity of trying to conduct kind of interdisciplinary comparative research and some of the novel methods that we've used to try and do that. So hopefully there will also be a paper or two on that outcome from that part of the project. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview, a bit of a whistle-stop tour around the project, how we've done the work and our aims and objectives, and some of those key findings which we will now hear from some of the other speakers on the specifics of that. I'm not sure whether we've managed to get Katie back, so I will continue on and introduce Katie Caveni, who was research fellow in the early stages of the project and has spent a lot of time working on the analysis of the website data. And Katie is going to talk to us about the framing of egg donation on the fertility clinic websites we looked at. Thank you, Katie.
Hi everyone, thanks for the introduction, Nikki. So am I unmuted now? I had a message. Hi. You hear me? Okay. So yes, so this talk focuses on our analysis of how egg donation is being framed on fertility clinic websites. So the first slide, the next one, Sasha, please. So this is just to say where this part of the research fits. So this links to phase 2 of the overall EDNA project, which was looking at the cultural representations of egg donation. And we decided to look at fertility clinic websites for this part of the project because we saw these as both central spaces where clinics recruit women as egg donors within a competing market. So in the UK and Spain, at least anyway, this was going on. And therefore, we saw these websites as being important cultural spaces where the discursive framing of egg donation takes place. So on these websites, there's the articulation, the popularization of narratives about what egg donation is, about why egg donation is needed, also messages about who should become a donor and why egg donation is useful. So on the next slide, I'll just very briefly recap some of what Nikki said earlier, because this was really important for this stage of the project. You know, at the time, as Nikki said, the UK, Belgium and Spain were all members of the EU and therefore all subject to the EU Tissues and Cells Directive, founded on this philosophy of the non-commercialisation of human tissue, including egg donation. But within this overarching regulatory framework, each of the countries we looked at had developed these slightly different regulatory models and diverging practices in relation to the governance of egg donation. And some of the important differences for this part of the project are highlighted on the next slide. I'll run through those as well. So again, this is the same table that Nikki showed. So I think the important differences for this part of the project really were around the identifiability of donors. So in the UK, donors must be identifiable to the recipients of, anyone born through gamete donation, they've got the legal right to find out the identity of their donor once they reach 18 years of age. And we have this national donor registry as well. Donors have got to keep their details up to date and things like that. But in Spain and in Belgium, there's a preference for anonymous donation. So in Belgium, you can have known donation, but there's this cultural preference for anonymity, and that's played out a bit differently. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on in this talk as well. And importantly, in Belgium, almost all egg donation occurs within the public healthcare system. And in Spain, it's kind of the opposite, with almost all occurring within the private sector. And the UK, somewhere, I guess, in the middle, perhaps a bit closer to Spain than Belgium. And this really impacted the websites of the clinic websites and the data that were on there and things, whether egg donation was occurring within the public or private system. We found a big difference there. And also, it's, to say again, there's a lot more egg donation going on in Spain than there is in the other two contexts. So you can see that at the top of that table as well. So that's another important difference here to give some context. The financial compensation as well, this varies between contexts. In the UK, there's this fixed amount of £750 given to each woman per donation. In the UK, it's a set amount, it's set in UK law, and the amount of donation compensation given per donation varies in Spain and Belgium. So this is something, again, we found was reflected in how egg donation was presented by clinics. And actually, really importantly, in Belgium, at the time we conducted this study, so 2017 to 2018, we collected our data, it wasn't permitted for clinics to directly recruit donors. So to prevent this commercialisation of egg donation. So in Belgium, clinics were not allowed to directly recruit women through their websites or in any way. Whereas this direct recruitment of women to donate eggs by clinics, by agencies, by egg banks, it was pretty commonplace in the UK and Spain. So that was another major difference that we found reflected in the data we were able to collect. So on the next slide, this is I'll just quickly say that we used this maximum variability sample strategy to try and identify different types of clinics across each of the countries to include, and we ended up with 60 clinics across the 3 countries. We used frame analysis to analyse web pages on these clinic websites around becoming a donor, around egg sharing, and around donating eggs. You can ask any more questions about the methods later, but I won't go into too much detail at the moment. Again, with the next slide, the conceptual framework, just to say that in this paper, conceptually, our analysis is situated within previous work, Rhonda Shaw's work on moral economies of giving, Kieran Healy's work around systems of donation. So again, I won't say too much about this now. We can talk about that later on as well if you'd like to. And these were our specific research questions. So when we collected our data, these were the questions that we asked. So we were looking at, what were the clinics using their web pages for? Who were they speaking to? And what we wanted to try and find out were if there were common frames across the 3 countries, and then if there were any notable differences. So the next slide shows some key findings that we found across the dataset as a whole, some general findings. So we found that websites were being used for the recruitment of egg providers, for information provision, and for the marketing of services across the 3 contexts. And there were some common cross-cultural frames that we used. Positioning egg provision as a form of altruistic donation or gift giving. And through these frames, women were portrayed as helping other women to become mothers by donating their eggs. So that was regardless of the actual shape that egg provision was taking place in each context. And we saw this common framing of egg donation or egg provision as altruistic donation. We also found a strong emotional gendered discourse of solidarity between women. This was present across the dataset as a whole, premised on this imaginary connection between two women, one cast as being in need and the other as wanting to help. So we argue that this framing, it makes donors intelligible through gendered ideas of caring, of giving, and it gives the message that this is what is expected of women once they reach the clinics in this kind of disciplining move towards donor behaviour. And this is quite similar actually to the findings of other studies that have looked at egg donation in other contexts. So looking at how egg donations presented on clinic and agency websites in the US, for example. So they found similar kind of framing, similar narratives there. And we have some examples from each country on the next slide. So from Spain, we can see these ideas about altruism, about solidarity. And again, in Belgium, we see this example, a great solidarity of women that allows women, specific women, to become mothers. So we can see those kind of common frames there. So in the next slide, in the next bit of the talk, we'll look at each of our national contexts individually in a bit more depth. So firstly, looking at the UK, we found that in the UK, websites were used for marketing of services, but also the direct recruitment of women to donate eggs. It was really common to for the web pages to have forms, sometimes little buttons where women could put themselves forward for egg donation. And we found that the dominant framing of egg donation within the UK context was positioning egg donation or donor eggs as a scarce gift that comes with an enduring responsibility. So on the next slide, I've got some examples that just that show some of this. So donor eggs, they were framed as being this scarce resource. There's this idea that there's a shortage of donors in the UK, and this came across quite strongly in our UK data, therefore giving donor eggs a high social value. And this framing interacts with nationally specific regulations and cultural practices in the UK. So including the things I mentioned before about the future identifiability of donors, also the acceptability of known donation in the UK, of egg sharing as well in the UK. We also have this defined compensation scheme here. So each donor is compensated this set figure of £750 per donation. This was very present on websites in the UK. And all of this interacts to kind of shape and nuance the meaning of egg donation in the UK context. So the donor comes to be understood as a woman who is altruistically motivated, at least in part. But also importantly, the woman who's providing her eggs is someone who must make this enduring commitment to her role as an egg donor. And egg donors in the UK data were often presented as women who are already mothers, women who've already finished their own families, and they have these surplus eggs that they could then use to help somebody else in need, whilst benefiting from various social, emotional, and or possibly financial returns. So in the case of egg sharing, for example, where women undergoing IVF can opt to share some of their eggs during their own IVF cycle with someone else to help reduce the costs of their IVF. So in Spain, the next of our contexts, we found egg donation was framed a little bit differently. So we've called our framing in the Spanish data of egg donation as mutually beneficial sisterhood. So in Spain, in contrast to the UK, there isn't a shortage of donor eggs. So that wasn't present at all. And ideal donors in the Spanish context were framed as being young, healthy women who want to help other women become mothers. Repeat donations were welcomed, and there was lots of appeals towards sisterhood and solidarity between women, and seeing these women as forging temporary yet anonymous links with one another. And again, in contrast to the UK, there was absolutely no sense in the Spanish data that these women would have any form of lasting relationship or contact between them. And this is in part to do with the very strict rules around donor anonymity in Spain, meaning the legal obligations of donors to remain anonymous was presented as a kind of tool for both donors and recipients to avoid those possible future complications or indeed responsibilities. And we can see this on the next slide in one of the examples that we've given. So I hope you can read this. I hope the text isn't too small. So in these examples, we can see how giving eggs is framed in this way as giving a one-off gift to another woman. The egg provider should not expect anything in return from this other woman. She's giving her eggs anonymously, she's giving altruistically to help another woman who she'll never meet, she will never know about. But interestingly, at the same time, this act of giving is also situated within a chain of giving and receiving between the egg provider and the clinic. So when the woman gives her eggs, she can receive various types of compensation and benefits from the clinic. And we saw this in terms of getting good feelings back from donating, but also free health tests and financial compensation as well. And we argue that this presents in a way a bit more of a marketised way of attracting egg providers through making these economic and other rewards visible, while at the same time presenting these images of solidarity, of sisterhood, of women helping other women that fulfills the legal requirements. So that's the Spanish example, and we'll move on to Belgium. So in Belgium, as I mentioned, there's very stringent rules on the non-commercialisation of human tissue, and this interacts with the ban at the time on the direct recruitment of donors by clinics. And in the Belgian context, this gave rise to a dominant frame which presented egg donation as a form of disconnected biomedicalised tissue exchange, so like a biomedical solution to reproductive pathologies. And like in the UK context, eggs were framed as being a scarce resource, and we hear that there's this shortage of donor eggs in Belgium as well. So on the next slide, we have some examples from Belgium. So, although there's this shortage of donor eggs like in the UK, like in Spain, in Belgium, there is this preference for anonymous donation. And this also positions egg donation as being a one-off gift with no enduring relationship between donor and recipient and no ongoing responsibility of the donor towards the donor conceived child. And although known donation is allowed in Belgium, what happens in practice is often this crossover donation, and this is a popular way to try and uphold the anonymity of donors, and this is explained quite nicely in the quote on the slide, the one that's in blue. So it says, because there's a major shortage in voluntary egg donors, we expect the acceptor couple to bring a donor. The donor will donate anonymously for another couple, and in this anonymous way, the donated egg cells are crossed to guarantee the anonymity between acceptors and donors. This way of donating is preferred, although known egg donation is also possible. So it's kind of the acceptor couple will bring a donor with them to the clinic who will donate their eggs to somebody else waiting, and that person, the person they brought with them, will donate their eggs to this other couple. So the eggs are crossed over to uphold this anonymity. So in Belgium then, we can see egg donation being regarded as a way that women are giving tissue as an anonymous gift to kind of indirectly help somebody that they know. And there's this very careful sidestepping, this narrative that suggests that the donor might be advantages sidestepped in the Belgian context personally. So we found this idea that women should not be personally advantaged, should not be financially rewarded for giving eggs, came across very strongly in the Belgian data compared with the other two contexts. So I realise I've whizzed through a lot of info really fast there. So the next slide will do some summing up and some concluding. So this links to some of what Nikki said earlier about the main findings of the project. So in doing this, this bit of the study, we argue that these socially situated framings of egg donation are really important because they both reflect and also form part of particular types of egg donation regimes. And we think that these regimes, they have implications for who comes forward to donate in each national context, and therefore how donor populations are constituted. They can also impact on the supply of donor eggs and have further implications for how reproductive treatments with third-party eggs and also reproductive markets are conceived and shaped more broadly. So we argue that these regimes, part of which become visible through clinic websites, are producing and reinforcing these different versions of egg donation, despite these countries all falling under the same national regulatory framework, positioning egg donation as voluntary and unpaid. So therefore raising questions about the homogeneity of the phenomenon of egg donation and representing this multiplicity of practices quite nicely. We say that these representations are important in a changing fertility landscape, as they really do illustrate the complex entanglements of national policy with supranational regulation, with cultural preferences, with commercial priorities. So we're seeing all of these things as being entangled with one another. And they illustrate the importance of, that we pay attention not only to the embodied and relational aspects of gamete donation, but there is this need to analyse the social and cultural systems and infrastructures in which donation practices are embedded. And we need to think about the normative and other implications that these broader systems have for the framing of donation as a culturally normative practice. So that's the end of my bit. I will leave it there.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Welcome back after this very short break. My name is Kathy Hebrand and I'm one of the other co-investigators on the project. So we had to swap things a bit around because we still have difficulties to get hold of Vincenzo. So we'll now hear from Christina Weiss, who is a lecturer and a medical anthropologist. So Christina will tell us now a bit more about the experiences of egg donors. I'll hand it over to you, Christina.
All right, thank you. All right, yes, so I'll focus on the experiences and the perception of women who provided their eggs. Next slide. And that speaks to and answers the question, the research question number 3, in how do egg providers understand and frame egg donation in the context of infertility treatment, and how is their moral reasoning shaped by a neoliberal bioeconomic context? And the next slide. So I was going to build on the context that Vincenzo was providing. So I'll give a brief context now. Across all countries that permit and practice egg donation, we can see an increased use of egg donors in the shifting application. And the one that is especially notable, as Nikki already mentioned, is the increase of vitrification, the so-called fast freezing, which is more efficient and allows clinics a higher degree of flexibility in arranging cycles and managing the treatment. And one aspect of this flexibility is the batching of eggs from one retrieval cycle. And this means that either some eggs can be used immediately in a fresh cycle and the remainder of the eggs vitrified and stored for the same recipient or additional recipients, or for all eggs retrieved from one cycle to be immediately batched and frozen for later use for multiple recipients. And that again leads to a transformation of the reproductive bioeconomy, which allows new practices of fertility preservation, as well as methods of procurement, distribution, and value creation. For example, clinics are expanding the egg donation programs, recruiting more egg providers, and are potentially increasingly motivated to obtain larger numbers of eggs from each individual. So based on this, we ask, how do women who provide their eggs for use in donation cycles perceive and experience the changing landscape? Next slide. So the data from my presentation comes from phase 3 of our study, and specifically from the egg providers. And we interviewed 29 egg providers in the UK, 21 in Belgium, and 25 in Spain. And without much further details, just to say that the participants that we interviewed represent all donation regimes that are possible in each country, as well as women who did not complete a donation cycle for various reasons. And the interviews were collected between 2018 and 2020. And we conducted the interviews in 2 parts. The first part was using a semi-structured interview guide, in which we asked egg providers about their routes into donation, their experiences with clinics and agencies, and their views on the use of their eggs and their knowledge and feelings about the outcome. And then in the second half, we presented them with a number of scenarios relating to the possible use of eggs within the clinics, and included questions about the storage, the movement, and potential commercial practices. You can see an image of one of the elicitation techniques that we used. Next slide. So some of the first findings on this. We asked the women about their recollection of and the knowledge about the number of eggs retrieved during their cycles and what they knew about how the eggs were used, including the number of recipients or cycles that the eggs were used for. And the women described what they had been told by doctors and nurses or by clinic and agency staff. Women's experiences varied across the 3 countries, and what they knew and how they felt about it depended on both the national policy and the information giving that clinics and local practices provided to them. In the UK, the information sharing with UK egg providers was the norm. However, clinics varied in what degree and whether they shared information routinely or if the individuals had to ask for them. So you can see, for instance, the quote by Emma, that's the second quote on the slide, who was informed about the number of developing follicles and the retrieval number. In Belgium, most egg providers were informed about the number of eggs they provided, but had little precise information about the number of recipients or the cycles that the eggs were used for. They tended to assume, or were told in abstract, that the eggs were given to more than one recipient. So you can see Lena's quote, that she was told there were 13 eggs, but not the number of recipients or what the clinic's routine practice is. And then finally in Spain, the egg providers were least likely to know about the number or the use of the eggs, as clinic staff tended to not provide information, and some egg providers felt reluctant to ask, though it varied by clinic. So you can see, for instance, the quote by Maria, who said, "They said quite enough, but that's all." Okay, next slide. We were interested to know women's views on the management of eggs in the context of vitrification, and so we asked them to consider a number of possibilities regarding the in-principle use of the eggs once they were donated. And following existing work on the commercialization of eggs, the second theme that I'm presenting is now about women's reflection on the potential for clinics to make profit from eggs, especially beyond the initial retrieval cycle. So next slide. So starting again with the UK. The majority of UK egg providers opposed the idea that egg donation should become about making profit. The clinics get paid more than enough anyway, said Esther. Or eggs are not something to be sold, they're something to be donated, said Rose. And these names are all pseudonyms. The UK egg providers shared a concern that it would be contradictory or hypocritical if clinics were permitted to sell eggs to another clinic, for example, while egg providers could only donate on an altruistic basis for compensation for their time and efforts. And some women reflected that monetary incentives could lead to strive for more eggs per stimulation and could potentially be putting egg providers at risk. So Gabi said, "They were just desperate to get as many eggs out of me as they could. It's possible that this transfer of eggs to another clinic, if they had sent or surplus eggs elsewhere, it might encourage to overdo hormones a bit to get 27 eggs. There's a bit more potential for abusing that." Okay, next slide. In Belgium, women had mixed views about whether clinics should be permitted to generate income from eggs. Around a third of the Belgian egg participants, egg providers, were okay for example, with the idea that clinics could recover costs of transferring eggs to another clinic. Their reasoning was that a fee for the eggs was seen as covering expenses that the clinic incurred by retrieving the eggs. So as Camille said, it is okay, yes, because they have made expenses. And then the next slide. And then the third example in Spain, most egg providers dislike the idea of clinics making too much profit from the eggs. Some feeling uncomfortable because they thought that they were donating to either a single recipient or a single clinic. Some Spanish egg providers were opposed to what they saw as clinics profiting twice from the eggs, something seen as a resale or a legitimate way of making profit. So, for example, the quote by Constanza, "I do not think that I'm earning money for the eggs, therefore I would think it's wrong that the clinic gets paid for the eggs." Nonetheless, most understood commercial logics as given, but problematized the practices as an over-commodification. Okay, next slide. So to compare, there were concerns about over-commercializations. With the majority of participants across the 3 countries were opposed to the generation of profit from eggs, there were different reasons behind this. In the UK, egg providers saw it as an act of donation that should not be commercialized. And in Belgium, it was seen as a reimbursement, so the cost is legitimate. And in Spain, egg providers took profit making as given, but opposed the extra profit. Okay. And the last slide, the big question, so what, why does it matter? So to conclude, in other words, the fertility landscape is changing. There is an increased use of eggs and therefore of donation cycles. There's an increased use of vitrification and increased batching of eggs, just to name a few examples. And these changing practices raise questions about how much information egg providers should be or are given about the potential use of the eggs once they provide them to a clinic, and about whether they should be involved in decision making regarding what the clinics can do with these eggs in the future. By talking about income generation and profit-making practices of clinics with egg providers, we provide a novel lens through which to analyze ideas about commercialization. Furthermore, our analysis shows that donation is not a unitary or homogeneous entity, or one whose form depends on individual motivations. It gives rise to an understanding of egg provision as a specific, embedded, and heterogeneous practice. So in the UK, egg provision was embedded within a cultural framing of altruistic donation, which coexisted with an assumption among some women that profit was being made. A finding that can be related to the economic reality that the majority of egg donation takes place within the private sector. In Belgium, where clinics are largely in the public sector, questions of clinic practices and profit-making were accompanied by a feeling of trust towards those clinics. Here, the main argument was that egg donation should not and is not about making profit for anyone involved, but might be at least partially linked to the economic model of reimbursement for costs, which tends not to be seen as a payment by most egg donors. And in large contrast, in Spain, most egg providers took commercial logics as given. Spain is the main European market due to the availability of eggs, as Nikki has shown in the beginning, and the majority of egg donation cycles occur in the private sector. Here, participants showed different levels of discomfort with the idea of clinics making money from eggs, and specifically with them expanding profit via batching practices. So to end, our findings raise important questions about information giving, and by extension, processes of informed consent. In a context in which donated eggs can increasingly have multiple destinies, due to technological and regulatory changes, it may be timely to consider not only ways in which we inform egg providers, but also to consider how they should be permitted to make decisions about the tissues they provide. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. It was really nice to have the perspective from the egg donors. Unfortunately, I'm afraid we still haven't heard from Vincenzo, and we still have this connection problem. So except if he gets back to us in the coming minutes, I think we'll just start with the questions now. We should have at least half an hour for that. So I will start taking the question. So, yeah, and thank you for the question you've already put in the chat box. So we have a first question. I've been finding out, how old can donors be at the time of donation? Do children have the possibility to know the identity of their donor in order to learn about the ancestry? Background in Germany, sperm donors must agree to be included in a register so that the children resulting from the donation have the opportunity to learn something about their ancestry and contact the donor. So who would like to answer that? Maybe or Guido, I think it's online.
I can answer for the UK context. So how old can donors be at the time of donation? It should be between 20 and 35 if it's ID release donation. But if you're going for a known cycle, you can be older if you're donating, for example, through a surrogacy network. So SUK, Surrogacy UK, for example, will take known donors if they're older, if they're already known to them. So that was for some women that I interviewed actually an opportunity to continue donating, and for them the opportunity to switch from ID release to known donation. The question just disappeared for me. So somebody else wants to continue answering.
Maybe, yeah, maybe Guido have some elements to add.
Yeah, so in Belgium, the upper age limit is 35 for anonymous donation, but it's close to 38 for known donation. And so the reason is that the recipient has to be informed about the increased genetic risk if a known donor above the age of 35 is being used. But again, obviously, there's the issue of cross donation where it becomes slightly more complicated. But anyway, above the age of 35, they have to be informed that the donor is over the age of 35, and so that they have to accept the risk or the slight increased risk compared to those below the age of 35.
Christina and Guido for this. So another question. I've been finding out about donor conception, mostly from the Donor Conception Network. They emphasize and has shown that ID release is important to the children born from donations. Why does Spain ensure anonymity? Is there any research that shows that this is beneficial to the children? Thanks. Again, maybe Guido, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, so as far as I know, there's no research showing that it is beneficial for the children. In fact, there's no difference whatsoever, even if they find out or don't find out. Look at the studies that have been published by Caron and by Annie Bos. So the reason why they are sticking to the anonymity rule is largely due to the fact that they consider this to be not essential information for the donor-conceived children. And as I mentioned, as far as we know, all the donor-conceived children are doing well. So they are just following the general rule that the new family is the family that is raising the children.
Okay. I will just follow up with the other question. I think it's really in line with that one. And I think we might have Vincenzo online after that. So we'll try to connect in. But just following up to understand whether there was an expression of interest in changes to the current regulation around donation practices, especially in Spain and Belgium. We're seeing a changing landscape globally around anonymity, and would like to understand this in the European context. Again, Guido, maybe if you can just follow up on that, and I'll see if we can get Vincenzo then.
Well, yes, well, the problem is that we are talking in this project mainly about egg donation. And so the situation in Belgium, at least, is quite different from the other countries, given the fact that quite a lot of the egg donations in Belgium, in fact the majority, I guess, are known donors. So that obviously doesn't even raise the question about donor anonymity. So since egg and sperm donation cannot really be compared, I think also not on this specific aspects of the donation. I think that it's really a quite interesting idea that whatever that is going to happen in terms of regulation, you will still be stuck with the practice as is being practiced in the different countries. So, for instance, I think that for egg donation, even if there is an abolishment of donor anonymity, you will still have a quite similar practice to what we have now. So obviously the cross donation will have to be skipped, but at the same time, I think the impact on egg donation will be a lot less than the impact on sperm donation. But obviously there is a change, and we will have to see what the effects of the change will be also in countries like France, for instance, where it's going to be very interesting, because obviously they were not exactly well prepared for the change in legislation that are seen now.
Yeah, some very interesting. So the plan, I think, now is to get Vincenzo on the phone via Nikki.
So we do have Vincenzo, but we're going to have to call him, which again, we haven't done this for a while. For some strange reason that we can't fathom, and IT can't figure out, we can't make him a presenter, but he is in the audience. So we're going to call him and try it that way, kind of old school. Let's see how that works. Hi, Vincenzo, can you hear me?
I will start from this slide, which is the slide picture from the past. And I'm taking or talking about the picture that you would find in a normal IVF clinic in Spain in 2012. So prior to the massive introduction of vitrification, the traditional practice was to take the donated eggs and use them in fresh cycles, and providers and recipients had to synchronize in time and space. The current, the most common practice was to match one donor with one or two recipients, and there was no or very little freezing of eggs. There was the possibility to freeze eggs with a different technique that was not vitrification, but it was hardly performed. So in that very moment, and with that very practice, there was an emphasis on the bond between the provider and the recipient. And you could actually talk about donation in this sense. There were some eggs going from a donor or provider to one or two recipients. It did not encourage the retrieval of high amount of eggs because they could not be vitrified and they could not be really used outside this interaction. And most of the eggs that were viable were fertilized and preserved as embryos and not as eggs. It reduced the availability of providers to local environment. You had to move providers from one country to another. That was very impractical. So most of the providers were recruited locally. And in that specific scenario, the clinic would act as an intermediary between the provider and the recipient. The profit of this kind of practice was mostly generated by the IVF cycle and not by the trade of eggs or by the eggs themselves. And obviously, as you well know, it encouraged foreign recipients to travel to Spain, in this case, but also to other countries, where egg donation was available and relatively easy to access. Can you move the slide? After 2012, vitrification started to become a common practice, an accessible one, a reliable one, and from the cost point of view was also viable. It had some interesting implications. For example, it helped avoiding the problems associated with synchronization. Now, vitrifying eggs allowed the provider and the recipient to come to the clinic at different times, not necessarily at the same time. It allowed a better and more effective matching because phenotypes could be stored and matched more easily with the recipients. More phenotypes were stored and the availability of them increased because they could actually make stock of rare phenotypes for when they could be necessary. And in the end, more recipients could be served. However, this implied some changes in the practice, which are relevant to talk about. The retrieval and the transfer were being detached in space and time. More eggs are being retrieved per cycle. This is a very important aspect because we moved from 12 eggs retrieved on average in 2009 to 19 in 2020, 10 years later. Obviously, eggs could be stored for years and traded nationally and internationally, which is now common practice in Spain. Providers may not necessarily proceed from local context. They could come from everywhere because eggs start to move around, not just the providers. And clinics have, at least in Spain, claimed proprietary rights on the spare eggs, which means that profit could now proceed from the IVF cycle and from the commercialization of frozen eggs that were unused in the first fresh cycle or in the first place. And this also facilitated the appearance or the emergence of commercial egg banks, at least in Spain. Obviously, you need enough eggs to have a bank, but this somehow materialized in Spain. Can we move on? The question then is how common, how relevant is vitrification in the 3 countries? So this is where we go to some data, and we could see that there are big differences between the 3 countries. In Belgium, egg donation per se is not a very big portion of all IVF cycles, and within this 2% that is egg donation, donor egg vitrification, it's very little. And in the UK, the situation is slightly bigger, so there is more egg freezing cycles, but they're mostly undertaken by a very small amount of clinics, which means that most of the clinics still work with fresh eggs. And we can see that there is an increase in the past years. So there is a trend, but numbers are still quite low. The situation in Spain is different. We know that donated eggs are 30%, nearly 30% of all IVF cycles. And within this 30%, vitrified eggs are more or less 1/3 of all of them, a little more actually. So vitrification in Spain is definitely a reality. It's being routinized and it's growing. Interestingly, on average, 5 eggs are frozen per each cycle of egg donation, which means that normally there are at least 5 eggs on average, 5 eggs that get that are unused that get frozen for another cycle. Can you move on? As a conclusion to what I was mentioning before, and before we move on talking about the business models, so we can definitely see that vitrification is still quite marginal in both the UK and Belgium because there are some conditions that are not met. First of all, clearly it requires an excess of supply to take off as a practice, and we couldn't find any excess of supply in UK or Belgium. In both countries, there is still doubt over the equivalence with fresh eggs, and it's still being used. Vitrification is still being used as a backup plan or as an alternative to embryo freezing. So sometimes it's even an option for recipients to choose. It's not a real alternative at the moment, but in Spain, it is becoming the standard. There are commercial banks that are emerging, not just one, but several. It is opening up for a second moment for the commercialization of oocytes, which are removed from the donor initial consent from the moment in which the donor was actually involved in the practice. And it has encouraged a new profit-generating model, which we'll be discussing in the next slides, where profits proceed from the egg trade, so from the actual selling of the eggs, not from the IVF treatment, as it was the case in 2012. Next slide. Now talking about the three business models I was somewhat mentioning during the previous slides. When vitrification becomes a routine practice, and that's clearly only the Spanish case for the moment, three different business models coexist. One, the traditional model, if we want to call it, it's where fresh eggs are fertilized and the leftover from these eggs are turned into embryos and frozen as embryos. This seems to be still the dominant model in Belgium and the UK. But there are two more business models that emerged. One is the surplus model. So the unallocated eggs get frozen as eggs, and then they can be used internally, which means within the clinic, or effectively traded outside to other clinics in the country or elsewhere in Europe or in the world. And then there is a third model, which is the proper commercial bank model, where all eggs are frozen, split up in batches of 5 or 6, and sold out. So no treatment offered, just the selling of eggs. Next slide. In Belgium, as we said, the traditional model is still dominant. There is some evidences that the surplus model may be emerging, but it's still very limited. But frozen eggs are only used for internal patients, not shipped anywhere, and there are no commercial banks. The majority of clinics use the traditional fresh eggs model, 1 donor to 2 recipients. Less clinics using frozen and providing 2 batches of 6 per recipient. And other seems to be using both models. We know that the fees or the compensation for the donor is between 500 and 2,000 euros in unknown donation. And we know that known donors are not paid. And there is quite an important issue with known and unknown donation, because anonymous donation is the only one that is existing now in Spain. And clearly it's more deep when donors are known. It's not viable that their eggs would be then frozen for someone else. But this is clearly not the case in Spain. In the case of bring your own donor, in the cross donation arrangement, usually eggs of the donor go to the same recipient. In one case, of 1 donor to 2 patients, the one that did not bring the donor may get the smaller share of the eggs. In some French-speaking clinics, we found that they were thinking of importing or planning to import frozen eggs from Spain. Yes, we realized that in Belgium, parents-to-be play a very important role as intermediaries for donor recruitment. We don't find this in Spain. We find some of this in the UK. Can we go to the next slide? More variety in terms of practices, but there is clearly a more marked use of vitrification and some examples of the surplus model in the private sectors. In the UK, we see something that it's clearly happening in Spain, and then there are fewer cycles within the NHS compared to the private sector. In Spain, it's also the case, and the differences are huge. The majority of clinics, again, work in the fresh traditional model, as you've seen, because there is scarcity of donors and because there is some caution about the effectiveness of egg vitrification as a process. So only a few clinics actually work with frozen cycles, and they mix fresh and frozen. Some clinics allow recipients to order batches of 5 eggs via the website, but it's only part of an in-house clinical practice. So eggs do not leave the clinic anyway. Egg import is hardly practiced because of HFEA regulation, because there are concerns about meeting the UK regulatory requirements for the eggs coming from abroad. Recruitment agencies do play a role, as they do in Spain, especially when it comes to find ethnic profiles that are difficult to gather. And in any event, they are considered expensive. So I think that there is a decline in egg sharing practices and certain cautions towards non-donors. But both possibilities are available in the UK, unknown donors and known donors. So, but if we move to Spain in the next slide, we see a very different picture. Yes, the situation in Spain, as I said, it's kind of different. We have seen both the interviews and the data proceeding from the SEF registry show that there is an extensive use of vitrification and that the three business models coexist. Few interviewees suggest they still use the traditional model, working with fresh eggs and freezing embryos, but all of the others use the surplus model, either for internal patients or to both internal and external patients, that is, selling the eggs outside. And we can find a number of commercial banks that operate along the third model, that is, they get the eggs, they froze all of them, they divide them in batches, and they sell the batches of egg to other clinics or abroad. Also, the interviews confirm the relative abundance of donors, the very limited amount of egg donation performed in the public healthcare system, obviously the dominant position of the private IVF actors, and there is a growing tendency, and that's, I think, the important data, of exporting eggs. So Spain is effectively making an effort to becoming an exporting country in terms of eggs. And we can see that anonymous donation play a key role here, because with non-donation, this would not really be possible. And there is a high number of eggs extracted per donor per cycle on average, nearly 20. And that in this, what I would call mature market, there is an increasing role played by intermediaries and banks that are making this transition towards the surplus model the standard. Next slide. Okay, so in practical terms, I think there are only 2 slides to go. In more empirical and practical terms, we've seen that in Spain, the 3 business models coexist. That the surplus model is the dominant one, but there are still some clinics working in the traditional model and some commercial banks operating on the third model. UK, traditional model is dominant, especially under the NHS system, but in the private sector, the surplus model is growing, and commercial banks also exist, but they only operate along the surplus model in connection with an in-house clinic. And in Belgium, again, traditional model is also dominant, as in the UK, but we did find some evidences of a transition to a surplus model, but not really to commercial banks or anything like that. So majority seems to report using fresh eggs and still following this traditional model of using one donor for 2 recipients, depending on the number of eggs retrieved. Some smaller clinics may be using frozen eggs and divide batches of 6 for recipients. Next slide, which I think is the final one. Right. So as a conclusion, we have all been working about the main factors behind the emergence and consolidation of these business models. And clearly, there are some explanatory factors that are making this transition possible or not. And obviously, we understand that vitrification as a technique and as a practice is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient, because other factors have to join in for this to happen. In general, the surplus and the bank models, which really only thrive in Spain, can only exist in the presence of a strong private out-of-pocket sector, when there is a relative abundance of donors, and when the donation is anonymous. And we also think that the presence of intermediaries and agencies positively contribute to the transition from the traditional to the surplus model onto the commercial bank model. To the contrary, in countries where there is a strong public healthcare system with scarcity of donors and non-donation, still the traditional model is dominant, and we think it's going to remain so for the next few years, because it's true that we can see evidences of the other models, but they're still very, very, very marginal, and I don't see the abundance of donor coming up. And that's crucial for the vitrification and for the second and the third model to actually emerge and consolidate. So I think this is it. I think the next slide is the thank you slide. I'm not sure,
yes.
But you see it. So maybe I can just stop here, Nikki.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Vincenzo, and thank you for.
Well, thank you for your patience. I'm very sorry for this. I don't know why I could not get in, but hopefully you got at least the main ideas behind the presentation.
Cathy, shall I hand it back to you for? I think it is over to you already now.
Thank you for this. Thank you everyone for your question. We have lots of questions, and unfortunately, okay. So I was saying, like, we have lots of questions, so thank you for that. We might think of creating maybe a document with the different question and some of the answer, and then we'll share with you at a later stage. I will just pick one question for now, one from Sarah Norcross for the panel. So what do the panel think of the ethics of the use of UK donor eggs by UK nationals for use in surrogacy in the US? Should egg donors be advised that this is happening, may happen? What about the disparity between what the UK egg donor and the US surrogate will receive? Nikki, maybe you want to answer to that one?
Yeah, I can start off. That's a really interesting set of questions, Sarah. It's not something we came across actually in our interviews, but I think what it does speak to is one of the questions we've been asking about the information that egg donors get. And this is something that Christina covered partially in her talk, and we talked to egg donors quite extensively about, in terms of, do they know what is happening to the use of their eggs? Do they want to know? Should they know? And that varied quite considerably across countries, but also within. And obviously you've asked the question specifically in relationship to the UK. And what we found was, Christina's talk picked up on this, you know, in the context of open ID release donation, people did think it was important often to know what was happening to the eggs. People across the three countries had an idea of what the recipients, you know, they had these imaginaries of who the recipients were and the configurations in which their eggs were being used, and this was often directly related to how that had been sold to them, if you like, in terms of the recruitment materials, as we saw from Katie, what clinic staff had told them or not told them, and also this kind of broader cultural imaginary about egg donation and how it takes place. And so often, you know, the uses for eggs don't quite map onto that. And so in the UK, women did feel that it was important to know more about, not everybody, but did want to know more about the arrangement in which their eggs were used, because they would ultimately find out who the recipients were, who the donor offspring were, and actually were often more interested in the recipients rather than the meeting donor offspring. In relationship to the ethics of that, maybe Guido wants to comment on that. But in terms of compensation, yeah, it's another example we see of this mismatch between kind of regulatory contexts and the discrepancies that arise. You know, we have that already, don't we, when people move abroad for fertility treatment using donor eggs. But the case of a UK egg donor being used for international surrogacy is an interesting one. Does anybody else want to chip in on that? Anything from either in relationship to the perceptions of the donors or the ethics, the ethical questions? I think you can unmute yourself. If Guido, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think that I agree with you, Nikki, that this is indeed a very complex question, and that when you start tackling this, you should start looking at the beginning. What kind of framework is being used? Is it anonymous, known, whatever? Is it being paid? Pardon?
Can you hear Guido?
Can I?
Sorry, Guido, I was just checking. I don't know whether you're live.
I'm unmuted. Can someone hear me? Okay.
Yeah, okay, I think so, sorry.
So I think it's a highly complicated question, and I think we should be very careful when we look at this question, also from the point of view of how to manage things practically. Because if you ask a lot of questions to donors about how they see things and about all the different details, it may become close to impossible to start distributing and to start allocating eggs, because obviously people will have completely different views on what kind of things they want to know. It may be about, for instance, who is receiving, it may be how many. So in the end, it might turn out to be, let's say, a very impractical thing to do. At the same time, at the moment, there's clearly still an open question about what the essential information should be that is given to the donors, especially if you use an altruistic setting, in which, to a certain extent at least, people should be able to decide where the eggs go, and also to a certain extent decide how the eggs are going to be used. So, but this is going to be complicated. And so the one question that Sarah asked is of course a very specific one. Don't know, I'm not sure whether you should include, for instance, this one, because it might be quite rare, but there might be other questions that are much more relevant, like for instance the whole question of to what extent the donor can decide if the eggs are going to be used to create embryos that are then going to be given for research. So this kind of thing is, if you start realizing the different steps, I think we have some work on our plate.
Thank you for your insights into this. Unfortunately, I don't want to take too much time, and we need to wrap up now. But before leaving the last word to Nikki, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank Nikki, who has developed and managed so successfully such a complex international project with a team spread over 3 different countries, and this despite the numerous challenges raised by the post-Brexit changes and the pandemic, and also despite all the technical glitches we've been having, like today. So thank you, Nikki, for having dealt so brilliantly with this, kept the progress on track, and maintained a great team spirit throughout. It's been such a pleasure working with you and the rest of the team, and I hope we'll all have soon the opportunity to meet again in person.
Thanks, Cathy. Thank you for those kind words. It seems the EDNA project had one last sting in the tail for us with this event. So we've had a fair few challenges, and I apologise to everyone for the technical issues today. We got there in the end, and hopefully it's given you a flavour of this project and some of the key findings, and really the idea that, you know, what we were trying to do was explore kind of in a critical perspective, you know, the analysis of egg providers ultimately within this kind of wider, rapidly transforming global reproductive bioeconomy, and sort of to move away a little bit from the idea that, you know, of individual motives and individual givers and seeing people, you know, this as part of a wider, more complex set of practices. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of some of that today. We're going to try and make a note of the questions, and as Katy said, because we've got lots of interesting questions, you can't see them all because we didn't quite get to them all, but what we'll try to do is create a list of those questions and maybe respond to some of them as well and send them around. We have recorded this, so I'm sure that will make for entertaining viewing when we watch it back, but we will be able to edit it, so hopefully we'll be able to edit out some of the pauses and circulate it afterwards. We're also really keen to speak to people. We know that some of you in the audience today, and we've been in touch with many of you already and along the way of doing this project, that are doing work on egg donation in other national contexts, and we think that there's an interesting piece of work to do to put this project in dialogue with those wider projects and cases, because there are so many interesting commonalities and differences between the different countries, and we've already started some of those conversations with some of you, but if there's anybody here who's not part of that and would like to make contact, please do get in touch through the mechanisms that Katy highlighted earlier, because we'd really like to see this as the beginning of a set of new questions and conversations. So we're going to sign off. We've run over slightly. Thanks for sticking with us through the technical issues and in the little overrun, and apologies again for not getting to all the questions. But thank you to the team and to all of those who helped us, the advisory group, and all of those that gave their time to participate in the research that obviously made this the project it is, and watch this space for more work coming out from the team in the not too distant future. Thanks everyone. Bye.